Hello.
Very good.
Hello. Can you hear me, Chris?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Brilliant.
Wonderful.
Which is good because I was having some technology issues for the last 15 minutes. I was getting quite stressed, but no, it's good. It's all working.
Good, excellent.
And how are you? How's your day been?
Oh, fine. Yes, it's been a nicer day today, more sunny. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And are you I mean, obviously, I see that you're still, you're. It's only this year you have papers published, and I'll mention it too in a moment. But you've got a book coming out this year. Is it so? Are you still writing? Like as we speak, kind of thing on other things?
Yes, I'm afraid so. Yes.
Well, you obviously love it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought what I might do is just sort of briefly introduce you
Yeah.
and um, and it seems almost difficult to briefly summarize such a vast career, but yeah, I'll try and be succinct. And then, yeah, sort of we'll move through some of the questions that, or topics rather, that we can talk about. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yes, that's good. Yeah.
yeah, great. All right. So yeah, Chris Frith, you are a emeritus professor of neuropsychology at the Wellcome Centre for Human Neuroimaging and honorary research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy, the University of London, and you are also a fellow of the Royal Society and the British Academy. Your career has enabled not only an understanding of the cognitive and social processes which underpin schizophrenia, but have also elucidated how we all mediate one another in a shared representational landscape, or maybe what we colloquially call culture, albeit I'm not sure what a one-to-one mapping that definition would be. So yeah, your work has explored the underpinnings of schizophrenia from multiple perspectives, notably you and I guess at times by yourself, but also with the aid of your colleagues, have developed several accounts, or rather explicated different mechanisms which underpin schizophrenia. And as I mentioned before, have therefore also explained how perception arises perhaps more generally. From the 70s, 1970s, yeah, those processes which you focused on and have explained include the sort of deficits in social cognition through things like mentalizing, self-awareness, and I suppose that as well is underpinned by intentionality and agency. And these have culminated in explicit frameworks such as the comparator model. And then I suppose from there and more recently, your work has increasingly leaned into sort of Bayesian accounts of perception to explain, again, schizophrenia, but also who we are generally are and how we're defined by our priors and how that is mediated by culture, just as a way in a sense, in a way that a node is mediated by its network and as a result mediates its network. You've written I believe hundreds of academic papers and several books, including The Cognitive Neuropsychology of Schizophrenia and Making Up the Mind, How Our Brains Create Our Mental World. And not only have you written in traditional formats, but you, I believe with your wife and son, have also written a graphic novel, Two Heads. And perhaps more saliently, you have an upcoming book being released, I think in September, What Makes Us Social. So yeah, please correct me if I've misrepresented you or misaligned you. Yeah.
That seems very thorough. But I would, yes, I particularly would like to promote the graphic novel, which was a new venture
Yeah.
we very much enjoyed doing and tries to explain some of the things you were talking about in a more entertaining format.
Right. Okay. That would make sense. I've not, I will most probably having you emphasize that, I will now probably read it because graphic novels are typically not something I read.
Right, yeah.
Um, But I suppose I mean, what was I'm curious, was it a kind of just a moment of creativity or sort of spontaneity as to, let's do a graphic novel, or is it to appeal to a particular audience?
I think it was more the former. I mean, there were two reasons behind it, I guess. One was there's a wonderful graphic novel called Logic Comics, which we had seen, which is in comic strip form, tells you the history of the development of logic and philosophy in the late 19th and early 20th century, based around the life of Bertrand Russell.
Right.
And of course, Wittgenstein, Frege, Gödel, all these people appear in it, and they're all completely mad, as we know they probably were. And it's fascinating that in this format, you get to understand a bit about logic and Gödel's theorem and all that sort of thing. So that we thought this is really a new way of using comic strip format. And the other reason was that we were given some money we got a French prize, which was slightly strange because they wouldn't give us the money until we had signed a contract to write a book, which is the one that's coming out in September. But every day we were walking through Paris, and there's a wonderful street called Rue Dante, which is entirely full of shops selling graphic novels. And of course, the French have a very different attitude to graphic novels, and in the same shop, you will find a graphic novel of Spider-Man and another graphic novel of Proust or something like that. So
yeah, it makes, when you state all of that, it makes actually a lot of sense. And I can actually imagine now how it's a sort of maybe quite refreshing, and I suppose it's novel, isn't it? It's a different way of digesting information.
I mean, the other reason was that when you give a scientific talk, you always have to have slides. And in fact, it's much easier to show how experiments work, and particularly what brain images look like, if you have lots of pictures.
Yes.
Again, that the comic strip was a good way of doing that.
Yeah. Okay. So, and then then you've also got the book coming out not long actually. About a month after? Probably just over a month then.
Yeah.
That's exciting. So I thought it would be good to briefly, or if you could sort of give it, how is it that you like to give an account of perhaps to somebody who is not familiar with it, predictive processing, coding, and sort of Bayesian perception, really, so that anybody, for those listening who are not too familiar with it, have an understanding of the general kind of tenets of it, because I think a lot of your work can be made sense of in light of it.
Yeah. Okay, it's sometimes called the Bayesian approach because Thomas Bayes invented the statistics that we use, but the main person behind it is Hermann Helmholtz, who was a 19th century polymath, I would say, because he made major contributions to physics and to physiology. But he pointed out for the first time that when we look at the world, we're not seeing things directly. We're using our senses, our eyes, ears, and so on, to get evidence about what's out there. And these senses are actually rather crude. And they're often, what we see is ambiguous. So, for example, a vision, only in the very middle of our field of view do we actually see things in detail. And we're constantly moving our eyes about. So the picture of the world on our retina is jumping about all over the place, but we're entirely unaware of this. We see a stable world in front of us. And he's pointing out that because the evidence from our senses is so crude and ambiguous, we actually need to do some sort of inference process. So when we see something, it's actually a combination of what we expect to see and the evidence of our eyes. And the sort of example that my friend Daniel Yon thought of is that if you're in the desert in a sandstorm and you see a ghostly creature coming towards you that's a bit white, you would not assume that it's a polar bear, you assume that it's a white camel. And this is an example of where your vision is particularly impaired, say by the sandstorm, you're going to pay even more, put even more weight on your expectations about what is likely in this context. And that's another aspect of this system. So you have your expectation, your hypothesis of what might be there. You have your evidence from your senses of casting some light on this, and you have to take into account of their reliability. So if your senses are being messed up by the sandstorm or whatever, or something wrong with your eyes, you'll put more weight on your prior expectation. If you're in a situation where you don't really have any idea what's going to happen, you're going to put more weight on your senses. So that's my attempt to explain this predictive coding of points. So its prediction is the critical thing, not just the sensation.
Yep. And I think that's really eloquently put. And what you sort of, I suppose, touched on there with this sort of that dynamic or kind of vacillating between placing weight upon one's prediction or the sensory evidence, that bears upon, I believe, what is called precision, right?
Yes.
So,
yeah. The precision is the reliability. Yes. So you put more weight on the thing with higher precision. Yes. And precision is the opposite of variability, if you like. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And with regards to sort of the cognitive and the computational sort of hierarchy, I suppose maybe in all organisms, but at least in humans, would it be fair to say that higher up the hierarchy, the predictions that are dealt with are more abstract, are perhaps have greater a temporal depth, whereas I believe I have a quote from one of your papers, which essentially says precision control has an important function at the top as well as at the lower levels of control. But as we move up the cognitive hierarchy, precision becomes increasingly more difficult to estimate. This is because at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have very accurate estimates of the precision, for example, a single sensory channel. And then as we move up, there's more combinations and confluences which arise.
Yeah. And you need more time, you need more evidence and more time to build up your estimate of the precision. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so then in terms of, if we sort of move, so it would be, what I'd like to do is come back to this kind of model, I guess, and because I guess your work has really now has been focusing on how our own generative, that hierarchy that we all have as an agent, as an organism, it's our priors, particularly at the top of the hierarchy, are sort of mediated or modulated by those around us. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we talk about this in the forthcoming book, but most of what we can obviously learn about the world by trial and error. You eat things, and if it kills you, then it's probably a bad idea. But I mean, the point I'm making there is that actually for humans, in particular, not just for humans, most animals learn about the world also by simply observing their conspecifics. And this is particularly true of humans. So we eat what other people eat, and we go where other people go, and so on. And humans have this additional ability that we can actually talk to each other. So we can say, do not eat rotten food or something like that, or what are the death cap mushrooms or something like that, so that you can avoid making these mistakes that our distant ancestors had to do by trial and error. And in a sense, when people tell us what's good to eat, where is good to go, what sort of good ideas are to have, they are supplying the priors for our perceptions. So that's why I think this is where culture comes in. So what people, I mean, I'm assuming I'm defining culture as basically what other people say to us or what we read in books or see in films or whatever it may be. And of course, the advantage from the point of view of precision is if I had to estimate the precision myself from my own experience, there's very little data. But if I'm getting precision from everybody else around me, or even everybody else who's ever existed or written about it, I'm getting precision based on far much more data. So it's much more reliable. So I think that's why in fact, there's even evidence that we put more weight on what we get from other people and what we get from ourselves.
Yes, and that, I suppose, can explain, and from reading your work, one of the ways in which schizophrenia can be explained is a sort of resistance to that reliance or ability to place weight on the culture almost.
Yeah.
There's almost that the priors, somebody who has schizophrenia, or I don't know, an acute psychosis, is perhaps less, their generative model is less, I don't say, like permeable almost to having their priors updated.
Yeah, I mean, this is a relatively recent idea, and my long experience in the study of schizophrenia is that all theories of schizophrenia are wrong. But so this is the current idea. But yes, you're exactly right. I mean, one of the features of, say, paranoid delusions is that they are impervious to evidence from other people. And the patient is actually extremely clever at explaining why this evidence should be ignored. So then it's not that they're stupid or they're irrational, they're just really fixated on these prior expectations. And yes, it does indeed seem as if they are no longer accept or take account of what other people say to them. And as a result of that, of course, they can go off in strange directions about what they believe about the world. I mean, to some extent, what we believe about the world is, as I say, is determined by everyone around us. And of course, occasionally this can go wrong. So you get what are called folie à deux, but you can get larger groups of people. I mean, often these cults. There's the famous case of, what was the name? Anyway, these people who went off to the jungle in Guyana, and eventually all killed themselves. I mean, a mass suicide event. And this was,
I think I'm familiar, the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, and this is an example where people can be, they can come up with a common view of the world which is actually completely disordered simply by interacting with each other. And you usually have one psychotic person who's very charismatic, who takes the group with him. And I say him advisedly in this case. But that's the sort of example, I think, where you can see how our view of the world is normally constrained by other people, and we don't go off in funny directions. But in the patients with schizophrenia, that seems to happen. But this is, as I say, this is at the moment what we like to call hand waving.
Sorry, what's hand waving?
No, I mean this is a speculative theory that needs to be tested.
Yeah. Yes. I'm with you. Yeah, and it would be, as I said, we'll come back to that. So, sort of sticking with schizophrenia, and I suppose because so much of your work and life has been dedicated to trying to understand it. And understanding it, I suppose, albeit based on, you've just said a moment ago that, I can't remember exactly word for word, but you said no theory does understand it, or something to that effect.
No, it's just that there's been a long history of trying to explain schizophrenia, and none of it has quite worked yet.
Right, okay. And so I'm curious, so what was it that initially drew you to schizophrenia and studying individuals with schizophrenia?
Well, it was partly a matter of chance in that for various reasons, I didn't immediately go into research. I trained as a clinical psychologist when I left university. And the first people I was introduced to in this setting was people with schizophrenia. in large asylums that they used to be in those days. And the second bit of chance was that my supervisor basically asked me to write the chapter on schizophrenia in his handbook of abnormal psychology. So I learned even more about it. And then I was asked to join a special medical research council unit to study schizophrenia. So that I was pushed in this direction. But I was also fascinated by the symptoms of schizophrenia, which is basically the hallucinations and delusions. And like all people in the 60s, when I was being a student, I read Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, which is about the effects of mescaline and LSD producing fascinating visual hallucinations. And in that book, he actually speculated about whether this provided a sort of biological basis for things like schizophrenia. It was some sort of chemical that was involved. And I was also very keen on the books of Philip K. Dick, if you know who, science fiction writer who was responsible for Blade Runner, for example. And in most of his novels, people are having, reality is not what it seems. There's something behind it. And I was always fascinated by it. So when a patient with a delusion, why should I think that he's wrong and I'm right? Where do my beliefs come from? Where do his beliefs come from? So that was a sort of starting point for thinking about these things.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and it bears on questions I would like to ask later around sort of, the more kind of philosophical and sort of on, not necessarily only talking about the ontology of things, but just sort of the philosophical questions. Sticking with schizophrenia though, how do you define it, and has your definition of it changed over the years, and is that both, I say because of or despite, I suppose, at least in the literature, the research, the literature and the if you look at the DSM and stuff, it's evolved somewhat. For example, now there's schizophrenia spectrum, I believe. So has your definition changed, and where's that now?
Well, certainly when I began in the 70s, schizophrenia was called a functional disorder. And in one version of DSM, if you discovered something wrong with the brain, then the diagnosis was ruled out, which is a bit strange. And then not long after that, partly to do with the work that we were doing with brain imaging and drugs, it became increasingly clear that there was a big biological basis to schizophrenia. And in particular, before we got on that, and yes, and in particular, these symptoms, the delusions and hallucinations, it was discovered again in the 60s and 70s that their severity could be reduced by a very specific kind of drug that blocked dopamine receptors. So there was clearly a biological link here between the symptom and the brain. So that was a big change for me, and I think for the definition of it more generally. So then it was, they no longer had this caveat in DSM that if there was a brain disorder, it wasn't schizophrenia. And then, of course, brain imaging came in, which I was lucky enough to be able to use much before anybody else. And you could see changes in the brain. You could see what was happening when someone was hallucinating and all that sort of thing. So there was the idea that there's a biological basis became much more dominant at that time. But the other thing that seemed to me to be the case is that the critical thing was the symptoms rather than the diagnosis. So as I say, the symptoms are the hallucinations and delusions. The hallucinations are typically hearing voices rather than sounds or something like that, as you get in other disorders. And the delusions are mostly about other people, like you think that other people can read your mind, you think that other people are against you and are trying to destroy you in various ways. You think that people on television are talking to you specifically. So there are very specific aspects of these symptoms which I think have a sort of social context. They seem to be always about other people in some way. So that was a change. And I think I now believe that schizophrenia has many different causes.
Okay.
So, for example, there's something like 2% are probably caused by a very rare autoimmune disease that can actually be cured if you find out about it. But then that leaves all the other 98% that you. So that's why I like to concentrate on the symptoms and say what we try to explain is the symptom, which may have many different causes. So that would be one aspect of this. And as you say, there's the spectrum idea, which I'm not entirely fond of, but it's certainly the case that you can get people who hear voices you would say are not psychotic or schizophrenic, and this is mainly because the voices say nice things and don't interfere with their daily lives. I mean, another feature of schizophrenia, and certainly in the old definitions, and I think still too, is you not only have to have the symptoms, but your sort of functioning in society has been impaired in various ways.
And that's really interesting you say that, because you mentioned that was it. So you've written before, so you said, for example, I know of a patient who had a successful career in accountancy. Despite severe psychotic delusions, these delusions remained encapsulated and did not interfere with day-to-day work. Problems with precision control at the automatic level would lead to much greater impairments than those typically associated with schizophrenia.
Yeah. So this is a rare case, but it does show that some of the theories of schizophrenia would say, they wouldn't be able to walk properly. So I'm trying to make the point that it really is happening at this very high level.
Right.
And I presume if this chap had revealed what his delusions were to some of his colleagues, he would probably have been sacked. But that means, so he was sensible enough.
Yeah. And so, would you say then? I mean, the crux, or at least a key, maybe the crux of it is, or maybe not, but perhaps more around delusions, and that being defined as intention, like the sort of inferred mental landscape or shared representation of the social network one is within, almost.
Yeah, I would like, that would be my current view.
Right. Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, hallucinations are, again, there's a funny, we wrote a paper about this, classically there's a distinction made between hallucinations and delusions. So hallucinations where you see things or hear things that are not there, and the delusions where you have a funny belief. But you can probably see from the Bayesian story, the predictive coding story, that there's not such a big difference, because we say perception depends on a prior belief. So it's so that the distinction between the hallucination and the delusion is not such an important one, perhaps, after all. So yes, but I would agree. So it's mostly about having strange beliefs. And as you say, I would now say it's because these beliefs are no longer properly constrained by your culture.
And what I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the early 2000s, or it might be in the late 90s, that it was formulated, when you formulated it, but the comparator model.
Yeah.
So I suppose that slightly bears upon what we've just been talking about, maybe but slightly differently, because how do I phrase it? So yeah, so if I'm just trying to find it, I did write it down. Here we are. So yeah, on your research summary on the UCL website, it states, in particular, I'm trying to delineate the mechanisms underlying the human ability to share representations of the world. And this ability that makes communication possible, I think there are two major processes involved. The first is an automatic form of priming, sometimes referred to as contagion or empathy, whereby our representations of the world become aligned with those of the person with whom we are interacting. I think that's kind of what we were just talking about there. The second is a form of forward modeling analogous to that used in the control of our own actions. Such generative models enable us to predict the actions of others and use prediction errors to correct and refine our representations of the mental states of the person we are interacting with. Oh, I suppose that does as well. But also is the predictions of ourselves. And I suppose that is what the comparator model was about. Would you be able to explain the comparator model?
Yes. Now, this is the main point about the comparator model is that it was designed to explain just one symptom, which is the so-called delusion of control,
right? Where
typically the patient says, it's not me that's doing these things. I mean, even simple things like you say, when I comb my hair, it's not really me that's moving my hand, it's some external force. And it can be some very trivial thing that it's making you do, or it can be some more complicated thing that's making you do. And it obviously could lead to danger if it makes you do nasty things to people. But the key point is that this belief that I'm not in control of my actions, there's something else, somebody outside me is causing me to move. And this, in the early days, was thought to be extremely weird. And they say, how on earth can this possibly be? This is not understandable. And this is where I was very much influenced by Helmholtz again, because he made the point, as I mentioned to you, when we move our eyes, the world moves on our retina, but we don't see the world jumping about. And he suggested that the reason for this is that when we move our eyes, we actually send a signal to the visual system saying, I'm about to move my eyes. Any movement you see is due to me and is not something moving in the outside world. And obviously in that you can find that mechanism even in insects and things. It's very crucial that you distinguish between effects of your own movements from real things moving in the outside world. That's called corollary discharge. And so the idea was what would happen, and in a sense, you can think of this in terms of predictive coding, though I didn't at the time. You're predicting what's going to happen because I'm going to move, and then the evidence comes back. Has it happened as I expected? And if it didn't, that probably means something out there happened as well. It wasn't just my movement that occurred. So that was the theory, and the idea was that perhaps if something goes wrong with this system, this could account for this delusion of control. So I should say this is what enables us to distinguish between me moving my arm and somebody else moving my arm passively. And in fact, you can measure feedback systems. So when somebody passively moves my arm, I get all sorts of feedback coming from my touch receptors and so on, which I don't get if I move my arm myself. So in fact, this is why we can't tickle ourselves, because we can predict exactly what we're going to feel because I'm causing the movement. Whereas somebody else tickles me, I can't predict what I'm going to feel. So that was the idea. And so the suggestion was that in patients with this delusion, something was going wrong with this expectation mechanism. And with Sarah Jane Blakemore, we did a wonderful experiment where we had people tickling themselves in various ways, sometimes using robots. And you could show precisely that it feels less ticklish when you do it yourself. But when the patients with delusions of control, they did not show this distinction. So it was as ticklish for them when they were tickling themselves as if somebody else was doing it. And we subsequently did a much more empirical study where we looked at force generation. So if you apply a force to your finger, it actually feels less than it really is. And you can measure the force used, and you can ask people to you can get people to match the force exactly and show that you feel less force when you touch it yourself than when somebody else touches it. And again, the patients with this delusion don't show this effect. So this was an example of a failure of prediction, but it's very specific to this symptom. And other people subsequently followed up that sort of idea so that when patients speak, when you speak, obviously you hear your own voice, but you don't get overwhelmed by it. And again, it's because when you speak, actually, the feedback into the ears is suppressed. But again, when patients, this sometimes doesn't happen to the same extent. So that's a very empirical story of how this worked. But it was the start of the predictive coding idea. But as I say, it's very specific to this symptom.
Yes. And so you're saying, so when the comparator model was, when you were formulating it, predictive coding wasn't actually at that point explicitly in mind?
No.
Okay, right. And it just happened to be sort of harmoniously.
Yes, I say that, yes, then we were able to develop it and show that predictive coding was an even better way of looking at it. I mean, some people say, well, predictive coding shows that the monitoring model was wrong. I mean, that's a... So there are different ways of looking at this, but I see this as all part of the same story. Yeah.
Yes. And I suppose then one can't help but think, well, going off that account which you just talked about there, about this sort of breakdown between the predictions one has about their predictions and then the feedback they get.
Yeah.
Obviously there's been work and sort of like the biological, maybe it would be unfair to even call it a hypothesis now because of the evidence for it, but brain sort of neuronal disconnectivity and I suppose it could also be explained by that and synaptopathy and things.
Yeah. I mean, certainly with the prediction would be that there must be some sort of disconnection, but so far we have not. I mean, there is some recent work in this direction, but so far it's not been possible to, specify the circuit and where the disconnection is.
Okay.
So in that sense, it remains a speculation.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And I suppose it's always for those as well, particularly who, again, might be new or sort of familiarizing themselves with predictive processing, or perhaps for people who are first hearing about it, these predictions which you're speaking of, they are automatic and often unconscious.
Yes, I mean, that was interesting. Helmholtz himself referred to them as unconscious inferences.
Yeah.
And he was attacked by the intellectuals and philosophers of the time, which was 1870 or something, saying this is ridiculous. Inferences have to be conscious. If you're saying you can have unconscious inferences, doesn't this destroy the whole of the legal system? And
wow, I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
And he said he was very sorry he'd called them that, and it was a mistake, and he wished he'd called it something else. And he attacked the Schopenhauer. And,
He what, the Schopenhauer, sorry?
He said this is all due to silly ideas from people like Schopenhauer.
Yeah, that would be in line with Schopenhauer. Yeah. Funny. And it actually makes me think as well, I remember reading, I'm pretty sure when Freud, I'm only mentioning not because his work bears upon what we're talking about, but in the sense of that kind of unconscious, I suppose, well, psychoanalysis in a way is unconscious inference, and he was pushed back against initially, I believe.
Yeah.
So very sort of similar. So yeah, I was going to ask, we've already gone over it, that sort of different difficulty in distinguishing between hallucinations and delusions. So I suppose I have a question actually in terms of with schizophrenia.
Yeah.
When do you, from all of your work, feel that the word, the diagnosis is appropriate? And because obviously, I suppose schizophrenia is in a way chronic psychosis.
Yes.
Would that be fair to say?
It can be acute. Yeah.
So if somebody has acute psychosis, you would also think it's fair to use the term schizophrenia.
But again, there are funny rules, so I think it has to last for 6 months or something like that. Right. I mean, certainly someone who came in with acute, sudden hallucinations and delusions, the psychiatrist's first thought would be drugs.
Okay.
So, LSD or amphetamine or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't really know enough about it, but I would have thought the types of hallucinations and delusions are actually subtly different.
And has your work, therefore, I suppose, as time's progressed, become increasingly theoretical in a sense, and that you've
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So in the good old days, which was in the 70s, I was in this unit in a hospital pretty much devoted to studying schizophrenia. And my lab, so-called, was in the middle of the acute psychosis ward. So I saw people every day. And it was quite good because, of course, they're very bored and they would come and knock on the door and say, have you got any more experiments for me to do and that sort of thing. So, but I was really in contact with people and I knew what they were like. And then for various reasons, we were moved on. And I stopped having contact with the patients on a daily basis. So from that point of view, yes, it became more and more theoretical.
Yeah.
And it's much easier to explain things when you don't see the people every day and realize that they're not quite what you thought they were like. Yeah.
And so would you say now how much would you, I don't know if almost portioning it in terms of your interest? So your work is very much now exploring this idea of, like how we co-construct a mental landscape almost together. Yeah. And so obviously schizophrenia is, I suppose, is almost provides evidence for that in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
Is
yes, yes, I would say that most, three-quarters of, yes, I would guess the schizophrenia is very much less. I still read the papers and talk to people about it. And of course, being very old, I would say, of course, it's not like what it used to be. People don't know. But most of my talk, yes, thinking is about, as you say, this sort of how social cognition works, how we're much less independent entities than we think we are. We're very much embedded in our culture.
And yeah, so I guess let's talk about that then. And I found I was, as well as reading the sort of academic papers, there was a British a part of the BPS. There was like a sort of a more kind of popular science blog. I couldn't work out if it was you who wrote it or if somebody had read your work and then sort of put together this piece. But it says in it, gossip is just the high end level of a universal truth, that most of what we know about the world we learn from others. This applies to fruit flies as well as people. They learn from watching other fruit flies.
That sounds like me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I think, I mean, so okay. So where did when was it the seed, or the kind of, how did this sort of idea come into fruition? Was it a gradual? Was it a sort of a moment you were sitting there and you're like, oh, this is how we should formulate it?
I think it was very gradual, and it was partly most of my more recent, the early schizophrenia stuff. So my wife Uta worked on autism.
Yes.
And I worked on schizophrenia. And we were very much working in our separate domains, although we did talk about it obviously all the time. And we were interested that both seemed to be social problems. So the autistic people have difficulty reading other people's minds, and they can't do it, and they don't seem to have any idea what other people are thinking, whereas the schizophrenics, you could say, are almost the opposite. They overthink. They infer that other people have certain attitudes and intentions towards them. So we started thinking about this sort of thing. And then I guess what happened in particular, so we were already being more and more interested in this social aspect of psychology. And then you may remember there was this sudden breakthrough with the discovery of mirror neurons, which are neurons that fire when the monkey does something and when the monkey sees the experimenter doing the same thing. And there's a lot of hype about this, saying this could explain how we understand other people's minds, because there's this mechanism in the brain, which now it turns out it doesn't really. It starts to explain it, but it doesn't certainly explain how mentalizing works. But this increased our interest in the social aspects of cognition and psychology. And in fact, we wrote a paper together, sort of about the social brain, talking about mirror neurons and mentalizing and all this sort of thing. And I think it started from there. We became more and more interested in social cognition. And simply by reading the literature, we discovered more and more about how many animals, how much social cognition is involved in all aspects of animal life. Like, as you said, the fruit flies. And the other striking discovery, so this is about, learning to solve problems by watching another animal.
Mm.
And meerkats, for example, can do that. And meerkats are very social, and we see them on television all the time. But what was striking is there's something called the red-footed tortoise, which is the most unsocial animal known to science, as it were, that only meets other tortoises when it has to reproduce. And yet somebody had done an experiment showing that a red-footed tortoise had been taught how to get round a boundary. If another red-footed tortoise watched it, it would immediately solve the problem. So even these incredibly non-social animals, you still get this social learning going on. So that struck us as a very important aspect. And that's basically one of the chapters in our new book, is about all this kind of learning.
Right, okay. Well, I look forward to reading it. And what's just struck me as you're talking, at least I now realize when I've been thinking of predictive processing and coding, very much thinking about it in terms of how we make sense of what you might call the corporeal world, or the more sort of the sensorial stuff. Whereas actually there is this constant abstract world which we are in.
Yes.
And we often I know I have, you almost overlook that. And that it is, as you say, it's sort of that it's mediated, obviously, by language. So who we are, we're constantly in a dance, really, with the world, sort of impressing us or imposing ourselves upon the world, and the world is pushing back upon us.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, another thing that struck us, we became very interested in this empathy business, which was started with a mirror neuron. So we did an experiment showing that if you give someone a little electric shock, the pain areas in the brain light up. But also the pain areas in the brain light up if they're told that their friend is getting an electric shock at this moment.
Oh, wow.
But then we did another experiment. We discovered there's a form of synesthesia. You know about synesthesia.
Yeah.
There's a particular form where when the person sees somebody's being touched, they feel it on their own face.
Right.
Which would mean if you have that type of synesthesia, you should not become a surgeon. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be pretty terrible.
Anyway, we thought this is interesting. If we put someone in a scanner, we could see whether the face area lights up when they're touched or when they see somebody else being touched. So that was fine. So we did that, and we managed to find, amazingly enough, one of our colleagues turned out to have this kind of synesthesia. So we immediately scanned her. And of course, we had a control group of people who did not have synesthesia, who had exactly the same experience. And the extraordinary thing was that the people who did not have synesthesia, nevertheless, their face area lit up when they saw somebody else being touched, but they didn't feel it.
Interesting.
So again, it shows probably we are all, again, it's an example of how embedded we are.
Yes.
In other people.
And it has many, and this kind of thinking, I mean, you're talking about, like, I suppose testing it. I suppose it's almost like one has to get tacit evidence for it, because it's almost such an abstract concept almost.
Yeah. Well, particularly if it's happening unconsciously, you can't ask people about it.
Yes.
So that was a big advance, I think, in being able to use brain scanning machines, because you could see things happening in the brain in response to events or stimuli that the person was not aware of.
Yes. And then, so there's the implications for it are, I mean, it makes, so for example, you can make sense of, if you think of things like therapy, psychological therapy, that is in a way a sort of a provisioning of priors, you know, between two people. It's a person, you know, perhaps, you know, whether it's through reducing or attenuating the precision of someone has of their higher up priors about themselves, or even offering sort of new priors.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a way of looking at it. I have very little experience or to do with therapy, but I think that's certainly an interesting, it's a very reasonable account of what might be going on. Yeah.
And also, if I suppose it speaks to, so if this is more philosophical, and I'm curious. Yeah, let's go to that. The philosophy.
Yeah.
What philosophers have influenced you, at least your thinking, and then maybe your work as well? I suppose the two can't necessarily be separated. Yeah.
Well, yes, that's interesting. I'm not very well read in philosophy, apart from reading logic comics. But I have certainly interacted with philosophers.
Mm.
And the first one I interacted with someone called John Campbell, who is now in Berkeley, I think. But he was very interested in schizophrenia and the monitoring theory. And sort of another, apart from, I mean, related to this delusion of control, there's something called thought insertion, which is where the patient says, thoughts are being inserted into my mind, but they're not mine. One of them says, well, yes. And he thought this was very interesting because, of course, in a sense, it destroys Descartes, because, you know, Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, which I think really means the ones, he had this idea, my sensory experiences could be caused by an evil demon, but the one thing I can be sure of is my thoughts.
Mm.
And this schizophrenic story seems to suggest that you can't even be sure of that.
Mm. And I've thought of, so, and yeah, exactly. And but there is that which notices the thought insertion.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and this is what John Campbell's interested. Because one theory, which is due to someone called Erwin Feinberg, but relates to the self-monitoring theory, is thoughts are like motor actions. So you could have a corollary discharge. So when you have a thought, you send a message saying somewhere saying, I'm about to have a thought. So if people would find that they were having thoughts that they hadn't thought they were going to have. But this philosophers find this very problematic, because you get an infinite regress. Are you having to think a thought about having a thought about having a thought, and so on? So John was concerned to try and come up with a sort of philosophical account of how thoughts might be monitored in this way, and maybe they are like motor actions. And that's been taken up more recently by philosophers like Joël Proust in Paris, about aspects of thought that you might think of in these terms. So you can certainly think, today I'm going to try and work out in my mind how to do some problem. So you're certainly intending to have a train of thoughts, and you might also have an idea of how successful am I likely to be. So there are all these sorts of aspects that might be relevant to thought. So that was a sort of philosophical aspect of all that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And a person, I mean, compared to some people, yeah, I've read a very small amount, but Wittgenstein, yes, with this idea of the shared landscape, I think because, you know, he put a lot of emphasis on language, and you know, he's sort of from the Tractatus towards I forget the second book he wrote, in philosophical investigations, maybe something like that. But this idea of language, the games we play with language, yes, and I couldn't help but think it might be a crude or sort of too reductive, but say, for example, individuals with schizophrenia, or maybe even other sort of what we call psychopathologies, words perhaps and ideas become, there's a very sort of that high precision And as you know, because words and ideas have sort of different meaning in different contexts,
Yes.
and so the person is not necessarily able to sort of be as flexible across space and time.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly a problem with patients with schizophrenia, because in a sense they're having weird experiences that other people haven't had, and they have to try and describe them to other people, in particular the psychiatrists. And I think so for example, when the patient says thoughts are being inserted into my mind, you could ask yourself, what are they trying to describe?
Yeah.
Maybe the words that they're using, they're doing the best they can with the words available. But I know, again, there's an interesting video I once saw where between a patient and a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is basically saying, "Are you still hearing the voices?" And the patient says, "No, but I'm getting these communications from the High Court." And the psychiatrist says, "You mean you're hearing voices?" Says, no, I'm just getting these communications from the High Court, you see. And it goes on for some time, and eventually the patient gives up and says, "Oh, I'm hearing voices." But it clearly wasn't describing the experience that he was actually having.
And that, so in the 2023 paper, 2023, it was, I think, released, Consciousness, Metacognition and Culture, one of your papers. Yeah, which is a really, really good paper. I found it really interesting. There's an extract that says, "Here I learn of the important distinction made by psychiatrists between signs and symptoms. Symptoms such as hallucinations or delusions are subjective experiences reported by the patient. In contrast, signs such as incoherent speech or catatonia are objectively observable behavior. The key point I take from this is the distinction that symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions are subjective experiences. In this sense, schizophrenia is a disorder of consciousness." Can you, almost elaborate on that a little bit? Like, in the sense of, it's a disorder of consciousness. And also, and what I'll add to that is, I know that you're familiar with Schmack at the Crick Institute, right? Because in that paper, you actually cite that the lab's work. And what they've very interestingly done in the last few years, I think it's through optogenetics, have been able to almost induce hallucinations, or at least, and so therefore, in a way, are they merely subjective, or at least in the sense that we can infer them objectively?
I think yes. So what you're really asking is, are mice conscious? And I would say yes.
Yes, I would agree.
That's very interesting stuff. And one of the tricks that she used is this measure of, it wasn't just that they heard sounds that didn't actually occur, but they were confident that they heard sounds that didn't actually occur. And so the interesting question is, how do you measure confidence in mice? And to sidetrack a little bit, confidence is very interesting because it's an example of what we call metacognition, as you read about in that paper. So this is me reflecting on my decision I've just made, or whatever it may be, what I've just seen. How confident am I? And so from that point, and we can tell people how confident we are. And that some people these days who work in consciousness studies think that metacognition is perhaps the most important aspect of consciousness to study. So the question is, how do you study confidence in mice? And of course, you can equally well say, how do you study confidence in non-verbal infants? And my friend Sid Quiddo in Paris had a very nice paradigm for measuring confidence in non-verbal infants. So they had to find the hidden sweet or something, and they had to remember where it was. And the evil psychologists, when they thought it was in the left box, the psychologists had removed it. So in a sense, they were correct in remembering it was the left box, but it now wasn't there. And you can measure confidence in the sense of how long do they search in it for. Of course, the more confident they are, the more long that they will search for it. And the similar thing can be done with mice. So the way she did it was, the mice presses the bar or whatever to indicate that they've heard the tone, and they expect to be rewarded. But the reward doesn't come immediately, it's delayed. And of course, they can start the next trial if they want to. They can say, I don't bother to wait for the reward, I'll just start the next trial.
Mm.
And the more confident they are, the longer they will wait for the reward. So that was her measure of confidence in these mice. So I think,
yeah, and it makes me think of this idea as well of like kind of access and phenomenal consciousness.
well, this is
And
all very much access, yeah.
yeah, and for example, when you talked of that person who was almost describing voices, but then was saying they weren't having voices, with regards to the courts, I think it's almost reminds me of visual neglect.
Right, yeah.
It's kind of, there's a sort of a phenomenon, according to the person, phenomenally, there's not, they're not reporting anything. And yet there is this sense that on some level, there is a register.
Yes, you mean they know the house is on fire even though they can't see it or whatever the experiment. Yeah. I think, yes, I was thinking more in the olden days, German psychiatrists used to say that hallucinations had a cognitive tinge, which I think meant trying to imagine that rather than hearing a voice and translating it into words and translating it into meaning, it's just the meaning comes straight in without the voice being there.
Right.
So you say, you've got the communication, but it didn't come through the auditory system.
Oh, I see. I'm with you. Yeah.
That sort of, rather than it being, yes, that would be my.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think we've covered quite a lot of what I was wanting to cover.
Yes, it's nearly cocktail time. Yes.
It's nearly what?
Cocktail time.
Is that what it is for you? Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess we could, I think, we've covered a lot, and I've got a lot from it.
Good. No, I enjoyed it. Yes.
Yeah, and I think people will too. Well, I hope they will. I'm sure they will. And yeah, I guess as well for people interested, to have a look at the work you've already done. The graphic novel, your other books as well, which perhaps go back to, I think there's several, but most importantly, I guess the more recent one, particularly bearing in mind what we've spoken about with the sort of kind of co-constructing of who we are and stuff. I think that the new, would it be fair to say the new book will be particularly interesting?
And I should add the new book, which is MIT Press, is going to be open access.
Oh, right, brilliant.
I mean, I think in the e-format or something like that.
Yeah. And also, though, it'll be available to buy as a...
Yeah. But typically, as an academic book, expensive. Yeah.
Yes, it's remarkable how much books can cost in academia. Yeah. Someone's making a lot of money.
Yes, I know. Not me.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's amazing though that it's open access. I think that's really great, because these ideas are fascinating, and I know that there will be people who will be really grateful for that.
Good.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say thanks so much, Chris, for this. I really appreciate your time and your work, and I continue to sort of go through your papers, the earlier stuff. I mean, I even out of interest went back to the beginning of your career, and I saw that you did work on nicotine.
Yes, I know. That's what funded my PhD.
Oh, really? Yeah. But I don't think I'll get too lost in the weeds with that stuff. But the more recent stuff I find really fascinating, and as I say, I'll continue to read it. And I wish you all the best. With what work you continue to do, and thanks.
Okay, no, it was a pleasure.
All right, Chris. Well, you take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.